Okay, so good morning, everyone. So remember that last week we talked about headquarter subsidiaries. And what I want to do today is a very important part that we start now is about entry modes, right? And because you remember the kind of entry program is why do we enter and the motivations, when do we enter there? We are not tackling that enough because I think in your industrial economics courses you have a lot on competitive dynamics, and I refer to that, but you will of course need to take into account what competitors do. And then there is the how, right? And there are different chapters in the Verbeke book which I will not tackle, but the most important ones I will tackle, and I will give you a framework which is not in the book, which gives you an overview also for your group projects, which focuses on entry modes and which decisions you can make. Now, today we talk about alliances and joint ventures, which are, of course, very, very important options to take and very important entry modes, right? So what we will do is I give you first a general framework. So we will talk about different entry modes and situate the joint ventures and the alliances and make sure that you know the definitions quite well, because there is some confusion sometimes in the literature. Then we will, foreign distributors I'm not doing, but I will focus on strategic alliances and joint ventures today, and next week on mergers and acquisitions, because I do also a lot of research on that myself. Mergers and acquisitions from developed and from developing economies, right? And then we will also compare some strengths and weaknesses of the entry modes, because it's important that when you motivate a certain way that the company will enter the new geographical market, that you know why, right? And that you can say, okay, these are the advantages of choosing for that one, and there are also some weaknesses, right? And we will also compare kind of firm-specific advantages with alliance-specific advantages today, which is also a new terminology, I think, that you didn't discuss before. We will also see when there is a trade-off between mergers and acquisitions and alliances, because in some cases they are really substitutes. So let's first start with an overview. And I think this is an important slide because this gives you a nice idea about what you can choose from. Actually, this is taken from a JIBS article, Journal of International Business Study, 2000 by Pan and Tse, who studied like 10,000 entry modes from Chinese companies. And in fact, there are a lot of ways to structure entry modes, but this one is an interesting one because it's kind of a hierarchical logic model where they first think that there is a basic decision that you should take as a company is the decision between equity and non-equity modes, right? So non-equity is then split in purely export and purely contractual. And equity modes are then split into joint ventures and wholly owned subsidiaries, right? So depending on the percentages of equity that you take. Now, the background idea of this structure is that there are some determinants of the first stage there, non-equity and equity, determinants that don't play a role in the next decisions. And the factors influencing ownership decisions, for example, are location, right? Location factors. And if you choose for export, then of course location doesn't play a role, right? Then you just sell to through direct exports to your own agents or to agents in the host country. So I think, for example, special economic zones and these things, they don't really play a role when you go for exports and contractual agreements. Second, host country risk. If you think about it, the host country risk is much higher if you go for equity modes. So exports and contractual agreements. So that's something that really is a determinant on the first level. Same for risk orientation and power distance, which are two dimensions of the Hofstede framework. Power dimensions and power distance, yeah, in an export relationship is not so important, right? Interaction between host and home country. And if you think about it, if the further we go to the right, the more interaction there is and the more you build up a relationship between the authorities also of that country. Advertising intensity, you can take, at that time, in that article, they took advertising intensity, advertising expenses over total sales. Well, advertising for export and advertising, if you have a local subsidiary there, a joint venture or wholly owned subsidiary, is completely other story. Right? You can also look into the interaction in terms of the size of trade as or the link of diplomatic ties, right? Is also different when you just ship products or when you will really set up a company there. So that is quite an interesting observation. We don't say that decision makers are really thinking, okay, I should first think about equity, non-equity, and then, okay. It comes out of the data and out of the model that they could model it as a hierarchical logic. The question is this empirically driven? No. You could also say some articles will also go for ranked order, ranked logic, for example. And then I show a slide, but first, of course, also point out that alliances here and joint ventures there, what is the difference, right? And because sometimes in the literature, it's very confusing. They say an alliance when they mean a joint venture and vice versa. In fact, an alliance is non-equity, right? So that means we will see Star Alliance, One World, between companies, between British Airways and a counterpart, but they don't set up an independent company. And here in a joint venture, in an equity joint venture, you have a new company. So that is, of course, alliance. I prefer to talk about alliances if it's non-equity based, right? So, and these, you could say that an equity joint venture, sometimes in the literature you will find that it's an equity alliance. For example, TNK BP, British Petroleum, and TNK, which is a Russian joint venture in the oil industry, ThyssenKrupp and Tata Steel, they had also kind of equity joint venture. So this means a new company. Whereas an alliance is, for example, when Google, to give you an example, when Google collaborates on joint research projects with Samsung, but there is not such a thing as an independent company, a new company that is established. Okay, so this hierarchical logic model really structured the entry mode decisions very well, I think. What you could also do, and that is also a possibility that is put forward by Adrian Buckley. It's not Peter Buckley, who is also well known in international business, but Adrian Buckley, he published an article called Real Options on Foreign Direct Investment in the SMJ, Strategic Management Journal. And this is also interesting because he points to a kind of increasing control, increasing reversibility, well, decreasing reversibility actually, because an export decision is quite reversible, right? You don't sell in a certain place, then you say, okay, in a certain geographic market, okay, I give up, and it was nice try. It's of course much more difficult to retreat when you have set up a subsidiary there, or you set up a joint venture, as we will see in the case between Danone and Wahaha, for example. Resource commitment is also increasing when you go from the left to the right. So internationalization is actually not something static, as they tried to explain in the earliest contributions. It was seen as if you took once a decision for an entry mode and then it was all set, which is of course not realistic. So you have, when you go from the left to the right in my scheme of PAN and SE from GIPS, which I just showed you a minute ago, you have increasing control, you have increasing resource commitment. Now the risk of losing a specific advantage, of course, increases as well. Moral hazard if you have a partner, and the agency cost of monitoring. Remember from our economics of information reasoning that first of all, you need to know whether your partner is trustworthy. Remember the bounded reliability that you have, and then that is and when the contract is concluded and you have moral hazards, the partner can behave opportunistically and you need to monitor. And then you have the last element, which is also interesting, the growth options and the information depth and ability to spot and exploit growth in that region, in that geographical market, we see the differences. If you look into export, of course, export control is very high, and reversibility is quite high. Resource commitment is not that high, right? It's low or medium. Risk of losing an advantage, not really, right? Your firm-specific advantage, your brand, your intellectual property, your patents will not be affected if you export goods, right? Moral hazards, you don't, I mean, it could be that your partner doesn't pay in 60 days or something, and then you will probably say, okay, I will not ship over there anymore, right? But it's not a high moral hazard because you don't have a real partner. You just have this agent which doesn't comply to the rules. Information that you don't have a lot of information, that's a disadvantage. When we go to licensing, remember in our scheme, licensing, and I put also franchising, because franchising is not in the scheme, but in fact is also a contractual agreement, which is very important, which is a shop formula instead of just licensing. You say also how the infrastructure or how the format of your shop should be, like the Benetton shops, for example. Now, in the licensing case, a resource commitment is also not that high, right? You don't really lose your firm-specific advantage. You have some moral hazards, because it could be that your licensee mixes up the brands, right? And in fact, that he doesn't comply with the rules about how to set up the shop, right? And so that is, of course, also a problem. And then you have medium, also for the moral hazards, and information that you don't have that much information about the local market, about how to market everything, about the local situation. And that starts to change when you go for a joint venture, or what they call here FDI. I would never say FDI because joint venture is also FDI, right? So I would say here wholly owned subsidiary. It could be an acquisition, or it could be the result of a greenfield investment. So I think this scheme is interesting, and in some of the cases, we model it like an ordered least square, and so some ranking, right? I see there is a question, but I cannot, I have two screens here, so I should, you can speak up. Someone has a question? Not really, okay.
Yes.
Yes, okay, go ahead.
Hello. Is it normal that you don't have the same slides?
Don't have the same slide? Yeah, there are some slides that I added. I will put after the lecture, I will put the slides also on the UV. Yeah, I added some.
Okay, thank you.
I added a few extra, right? And I eliminated also a few, right? I'm always, yeah, it's no problem. Yeah. Okay, so then we go, what I wanted to focus on is control of operations, reversibility, the risk of losing a specific advantage, and the moral hazard. Right? So then we have, with the two screens, it's a bit, but I like these two screens in front of me. That's okay. I will switch off one. Yes, because I should again. Okay, so what is interesting here is, so you understand that you can model it as hierarchical, or you can model it as an increasing amount of control, less reversible, a higher risk of losing specific advantages, and higher risk of moral hazard. So take that into account if you look into your choice of entry modes. Then, so that I wanted to add, because then you see the framework of all the types of entry modes, and between all the link between all these chapters. Here I have an interesting overview, because I know that many of you in the entry mode are maybe thinking about acquiring a company or setting up a greenfield in combination with the ownership decision. And I added this one because this is a nice overview about strengths and weaknesses of those types of entry modes. Now I'm going to comment on it next week, because now we are just tackling joint ventures, and I think you will understand more if we also combine this with the full acquisitions. But of course, I can already point out to some of it. And so in fact, when you have a greenfield investment, you add capacity and you set up a company from from scratch. And that might be, of course, you don't know, there is no existing sales yet, so that can be a risk. So a disadvantage here is certainly the new capacity that you put into the industry. Whereas with an acquisition, you don't have this. And because now then the speed is also a difference. And if you think about an acquisition, that's a speedy entry. And because you already take over a company that has a market share, has proven formula, whereas, of course, with a greenfield, you need to build up your company. And that, of course, is not, and you cannot react as speedy as in relative to acquisitions. So these are already things to put in mind, to bear in mind. And then with the joint ventures, so here I think there is a lot of discussion which I had with colleagues about joint ventures. And here a newly established joint venture. Now this is actually, the partial acquisition is a joint venture acquisition, and this is a joint venture greenfields, right? Now out of these four entry modes, the third category is the lowest in number, because it means that you set up a new company, but you do it with a partner. Now that happens, of course, but that is not the most common. The 1, the 2, and the 4 are more common. The problems with joint ventures and with these two categories will always be about divergent goals, and that is something that we will talk about today, because we are talking also about these alliances, non-equity alliances. We have the same problem with partners with different goals and different interests, and then depending on the percentages, and they share in the profits, but they also share in the losses. And the problem is, of course, limited equity means also limited quality control. Global, if you have full ownership, it's easier to manage everything. And we will see this also with the case, the Danone case or other cases. And also some risks of integration, of course. If you have an acquisition, you have the whole post-integration problem, high risk of integrating, and many years of difficulties. There is duplication effects, there is other types of views. So we will see that this also happens already in a partial acquisition. High risk of conflicts between co-owners. So this is a kind of introduction. So what is offered in chapter 12? Well, the meaning. And so first, of course, we need to be careful about the strategic alliance. What is it? What are the main benefits? Because many companies are doing this, but they work together with competitors. At the same time, they are competitors and they collaborate. And what are the benefits of this? Right? We will also zoom in on the dependency spiral, so that in an alliance, if you are too much dependent on the knowledge from the partner, for example, in the case of outsourcing, we will see that there are certain risks that in the end, the outsourcing partner runs away with some of the assets, and you are really dependent for innovation and for everything on them or for production. Third, we will also develop an understanding of the risks of this dependence, and the fact that some of your alliance partners can exploit or can abuse this in the strategic alliance. You will see the learning effect, and it's in fact a learning race. Why do companies share in an alliance? We will see that there are three major reasons for this, and they both want to learn, but sometimes the learning is asymmetric, and then they draw their conclusions. They say, I've not learned anything, so I stop being active in the alliance. And then I will illustrate how multinationals select wholly owned affiliates versus alliances. That will be at the end of today's lecture, and also the beginning of next week's, because there then we look into M&As. And in many cases, it's sometimes because of simple antitrust legislation, it's not allowed to form a merger and an acquisition. And then in some cases, that's what we also saw in the airline industry, for example, companies revert to working together in an alliance because there the regulatory framework doesn't limit. So we see waves of mergers and acquisitions intermingled by alliances, right? So if you would do a kind of research, as you can do, kind of look for keywords on strategic alliances, and you will find that there needs to be a mission. The problem is to manage it. It's a type of partnership. You see it's joined, whether it's true. It's mostly foreign. There are a lot of foreign alliances. What is also interesting is to see that the liability, there need to be statutes. So we will, in the literature, if you do an exercise like this, in many cases it's about technology and technology sharing. Well, there are some interesting articles, basic articles on alliances. One of the very important articles is the one by Gary Hamel and Yves Doos and Prahalat. Actually, an alliance is a way, a manner to collaborate with your competitors and still win. And that was new in 89 when that was published, and also the articles which built on it, and the idea of, at the same time, being a competitor and collaborate. Now, there are three major motivations for alliances. The first one is to share research and development costs. So many alliances are in high tech. We will see many examples today. So they are in the pharmaceutical company industry, they are in IT, and they are in high tech industries, and in industries where R&D, where research and development costs are quite high. And the company doesn't want to finance it on its own. A second major reason, motivation for an alliance is that you want, remember our triangle, right? With the complementary resources that you can use from your partners. Well, in an alliance, you want to benefit from complementaries in scarce talent and capabilities, right? And because these are products that you jointly develop, right? And you want to take advantage of knowledge that is in other firms. Right? That's a second motivation. And a third is actually you want to shorten the time framework to develop things. Because if you do it with your partner, it will go quicker. And because they have other knowledge, complementary knowledge to you. And in fact, you reduce also the risk of being too late. You are realizing we need to develop something, but if you would do it on your own, it would take more time. Another article which I also will use for this discussion on alliances is the article by Das on inter-partner dynamics, because we will discuss a lot about the dynamics in the strategic alliance. And then, of course, you have Gary Hamel, who published the idea about the core competence of firms, but also on competition for competence and inter-partner learning within your alliance. So if you think about, and we will focus on large multinationals, alliances is not something for small companies. In many cases, it's big multinationals who form alliances. And it's something that, for example, I have here my Nokia and Microsoft alliance. They are working together in searching, in producing devices, in entertainment, in advertising. So you see a lot of developing operators, alliances with foreign firms, of course, because I'm in my international business strategy course, we focus on cross-border alliances by companies which are rivals. So it's actually competitive collaboration. Here you see the three rationales. Take that into account if you are in an R&D intensive industry. The advantage of an alliance is that you can share the enormous R&D costs. Nokia and Microsoft together, it's big budgets, right? Benefit from the complementarities and reduce the compressed time. So reduce the time of development, because otherwise you might be too late. Now, a question that follows from this is, why do some multinationals gain strongly from an alliance, whereas others actually are the losers? And in many cases, the literature shows that many of the Asian companies really did well in alliances. Now, there are also, to give you examples of alliances in other types of industries, for example, in the cultural industry, Pavarotti and the Spice Girls, right? It's in opera and in popular music. So there can be also alliances in other non-high-tech industries. Another well-known example is the pharmaceutical companies. If you take Valiant Pharma, for example, they teamed up with Walgreen. So this is a developer of products and a distributor, but more a chain of drugstores. So they don't use, and so they have distribution. You could say, yeah, it's just distribution. No, it's really an alliance, and because they also develop things together. So the firm-specific advantages that remember that we talked about, the patents, the brands and the like, they are transferred and they are absorbed by my alliance partner. That's actually the purpose. Now, the literature focuses, collaborate with your competitors. They focus on winners and losers, many of the articles. Now, the question is, of course, so I don't want to focus on who are the winners or the losers, but there needs to be a benchmark. There needs to be a kind of criterion to know whether my alliance is successful or not, for evaluating the success. And we will also do that for joint ventures, so the real equity joint ventures, and we will see they don't last very long. Now, to test the alliance on the criterion of does it last very long is maybe not the best, but it's often done in the literature. To say, okay, the alliance lasts several years, so that's a good sign, they still work together on project. But in fact, what is more interesting to see and to evaluate as a company whether to continue or to stop an alliance is the change in your competitive strength thanks to the alliance. And there are actually 4 principles for successful companies, and to say whether to form the alliance, whether to evaluate whether the alliance actually to judge about the alliance, you should look into first collaboration. And so to see, to say, okay, it's collaboration, but it's also competition, but in a different form. So the question is, did we improve in terms of competitive position? What would have happened if we didn't, if we weren't a part of this alliance? Second, harmony. In many of the articles you find the harmony, but in fact, harmony to get on with each other well. Harmony is, of course, comes from the culture of Japan, for example, and Asia very much, and there is a lot of alliances with Asian partners and Western partners. The idea of harmony, to get on with each other well and to have a long-term perspective of collaboration. In some articles you find this, but that maybe is not what the company is after. You realize that the collaboration or the cooperation, and the difference between collaboration and cooperation. Cooperation means, yeah, you have still different goals. It has limits. So you must, as a company, you must defend against competitive compromises. There will be always compromises because you cannot do something on your own. What is important is the 4th element is the learning. And in fact, the learning effect, you need to judge your alliance on what you get out of it, knowledge that you wouldn't have acquired if you were not part of the alliance. And Hemel and Prahalad and the likes, they find in their articles, because they did several articles in a row, that, and that's empirically found, that many of the Asian, the Japanese, and in general, the Asian firms often got more out of the alliance than the Western firm. So the learning race is often won by Asian firms. Why would that be? Well, it has to do with the receptiveness. First, explanation that they find by studying and also by qualitative research, because you really need to see how the 2 counterparts, you need to interview them both and to see what they get out of the alliance, is that the Asian company was maybe more receptive and more willing to put effort into learning from the alliance partner. The second explanation could be that the companies, the Asian companies, they view alliances more as an opportunity to develop new firm-specific advantage. They said, okay, we want to team up with the Western partner to improve our research capabilities, not so much to reduce the investment cost, but to develop something, right? And the third is clear, of course, that they had maybe more clear objectives. What do we want to get out of it? And that's very important for a company to decide and to judge upon before you go into the alliance. What do we want to learn by it? And a 4th element is maybe the own contribution to the alliances of the Asian companies was more the tacit process knowledge. So for example, whereas the Western rivals, they put in more codified, standalone firm-specific advantage. And codified means, for example, a patent, right? Whereas tacit knowledge is more implicit knowledge. So the many of the Asian multinationals started as an OEM, as an original equipment manufacturer. And what they brought in was actually the manufacturing process, which is tacit knowledge. It's quite implicit. Whereas the Western rivals, they put not tacit, but really explicit knowledge, the explicit standalone firm-specific advantage. And that's maybe the reason why the original equipment manufacturer that produces components, learned more from it. We also know that some of these original equipment manufacturers became original design manufacturers. Design manufacturers and learned a lot from it. I think there is a question. You can speak up. Someone? No. Okay, so then what is also interesting to observe is that many of the alliances between Western and Asian multinationals are outsourcing. I talked already about it. So original equipment manufacturers, so outsources really, that they say production process is outsourced to manufacturing technology development is done by someone else. The risk is that, of course, that the partners entered the market on their own, and that's what happened. You know, the Tsai and Eisenrich. I will come back to that when we talk about emerging market multinationals. In the chapter, after the chapter on merger and acquisitions, I do emerging market merger and acquisitions, and we will develop a typology of these emerging market multinationals, and we will see that there are some which increased at the same time their advertising and their marketing experience and their technology. A company like Acer did. And Acer from Taiwan is a very interesting company because it's a cluster of firms, and it's a cluster that developed. In fact, it said, okay, instead of just remaining a developer and producing components, we can increase value when we go to the market and we increase our marketing budgets and we make publicity for our brands, and that's what Wahaha also did. And at the same time, we also develop backwards and we increase value if we are not just making components, but also designing them. And then you become, instead of an original equipment manufacturer, you become an original design manufacturer. They entered the market of their own and they also developed. And then you get what Acer calls the smiley curve, like the smiley, the little smiley, where you say, okay, in both cases, we create more value. That's a clever strategy. Now, weaker firms, which we call the kind of troubled laggards, they become more trapped in a dependency spiral, and that's what we call the ratchet effect. You know, ratchet, R-A-T-C-H-E-T, ratchet effect. So that is the fact that you outsource to an original equipment manufacturer, and by doing that, you do less research and development yourself. For example, you don't add, so the original equipment manufacturer was experienced in product and process design. And so in the end, you're not only manufacturing, they are not only manufacturing, but they are also doing all the upstream. And that has also been transferred to the original equipment manufacturer, which means that you lose, of course, your competitive position. And this is the ratchet effect. So you can, they can operate outside the alliance agreements. That's also what we will see in the Wahaha case. That there is some learning, and that learning spills over to outside activities. So the dependency spiral is very important. You need to be sure that that the alliance is not becoming an instrument for others to develop firm-specific advantage and then say, thank you, bye-bye. Now, when outsourcing, multinational managers should respect some principles. You know that there is a lot of reshoring. It's not completely the same. And you know that outsourcing means you go to another firm. Offshoring means you go to another country, but in many cases here it's not captive outsourcing, but it's outsourcing, a combination of outsourcing and offshoring. And you know what are the risks. Outsourcing doesn't replace
building your firm-specific advantages, because you let it do by them, and in fact you don't learn anything, you don't have control. So it's not a way to build up firm-specific advantages. And you could lose capabilities by doing that. And yeah, the cumulative effects of outsourcing, if you outsource everything, remember that we talked about, well, in the strategy courses with my colleagues, Manuel Hensmans and maybe Paul Verdun, you talked about the idea of the cumulative effects of outsourcing decisions, that in fact the core capabilities you will never outsource. And because that could be, and that could result in losing core competences, which you don't like to lose, of course. The core competences are your FSAs and your firm-specific advantages. So they must completely, and they must constantly be strengthened and not given to someone else. So not just think, okay, I really want a short-run cost effect, because the long-run capability loss could be higher than the short-run cost reduction of cost effect that you get by doing this. And we see also in the databases of our reshoring, and that many companies are doing now what they call near shoring. I was in a company a few weeks ago, and they said, okay, we did it far away, but of course we are too dependent on transportation costs and a lot of things going wrong. We now still outsource, but we do it closer by. That is something also which we observe the latest years. Now, it's possible for both, in many cases, the multinationals experiencing alliance and being active in alliances. In many cases, all is well, right? It's a nice entry mode, and because they both benefit, and that's of course the ideal story. But there must be a willingness and there must be ability to learn, and that's the most important thing. So they should, and the multinationals should disseminate their new knowledge also within the company, because it could be in some cases you see that some departments learn from the alliance and others they don't know. They really, it should also be a benefit for other types of departments in your company, which are maybe not the first to be involved in the alliance. But if you learn, you should also be able to diffuse it within your company. And that is also one of the reasons why alliances are perceived to be good and well-functioning. The nature of the firm-specific advantage that is contributed by the multinational, of course, affects how easily it may diffuse. For example, so there needs to be what we call firm-specific advantage mobility. So the research which is done, the marketing experience which is gained, ease of sharing without being completely embedded, that it cannot be shared through communication with other departments. So for example, if the design and the production department learns from it, they should also talk to it and talk to the marketing, to the financial departments, and because otherwise it's limited to a few people. Maybe there is too much sun. I will close the curtains. Okay, that's better. So avoid that what you learn, that it's embedded in a few people which might leave the company, right? Or a few departments which don't share it with the other departments. Now, how can you avoid that? How can you limit the replicability of FSAs? Because replicable, that is, clones, copy paste. I learned this, I will also do it, and bye-bye alliance. Now, what you should do in your contract is limit the scope of the alliance. Then you should say, okay, the purpose of our alliance, because there is a kind of contract, of course, on the alliance, is this, right? And in many cases, locate away from the headquarters. Locate away. The alliance is something that is done by certain groups, kind of project. In many cases, it's research. So research could be, of course, at the headquarters. But if headquarters intermingles, right, there is a lot of. So in many cases, they don't do this, right? They say the alliance is certain departments work together, and of course, headquarters knows about the alliance, but they let these people learn from each other. And do it gradually, right? Incrementally, and say, okay, now there is this checkpoint every month. There could be a kind of evaluation of the alliance and say, okay, what is the performance? What did we learn? Avoid nearby alliances partners that have no access to key critical technology. Then you don't learn, right? And empower, kind of give and work with gatekeepers. Gatekeepers to control the information, the informal information transfer to the partners. And so to say, okay, there should be people that really monitor the flow of knowledge from the partner to the other, the second partner, and to see that there is not crucial information. And in fact, sometimes in the literature, we find that Western companies are a bit too tolerant or too, knowledge. Japanese companies are very strict in keeping knowledge confidential. That's something that is also a bit more cultural in their culture. Western companies are sometimes a bit naive and share information on technological achievements as if there is, nothing to lose from it. Well, maybe because they are enthusiastic or because of professional pride, but an alliance is an alliance, right? So that means that if the others gain from it and they learn a lot and they say bye-bye and they set up, they go away with interesting ideas, it might become a competitor, of course. That's always a risk. So there must be gatekeepers, and many of the companies are aware, of course, of this. So in a nutshell, advantages, disadvantages, so balance this well. On the credits of the strategic alliances is that you allow each partner to concentrate on activities that best match their capabilities. And so that is something that you should do. And so the one brings in tacit knowledge, the other is more implicit knowledge. Right? You learn from your partners, but the idea is to build up FSAs, to build up competences. And the third advantage is that the alliance could help, of course, a company to develop it more quickly and to develop an effective process and to expand, for example, together in a new market, new geographical market or a new product market. In many cases, it's new product markets also. So it's a combination of a new product and a new geographical market. Disadvantage is, of course, the conflicts, diverse ways of operating, the objectives that are different, and standards, strategies that are different, and the kind of dependency spiral that one of the partners is really free riding on the other's initiatives and becoming too dependent on what the others are doing, and then that's a signal that you should stop. Now, I always like these pictures because you can tell more in a picture sometimes than a whole text. When you look at this, remember this is a case of FSA bundles that are dissipated. So you see the dotted line, the oval line is the alliance. And what happens is actually, and you see the arrows, and you see this arrow means that, in fact, the Asian multinational gets out of the alliance. There's a lot of things that they can use as routines, right? They can capture knowledge from the alliance, whereas here, and the other partner, which only put in standalone firm-specific advantages, which is like a patent or, right? And in fact, the dotted line means that they don't benefit as much, right? They don't, and the transfer here is just, they cannot capture as much knowledge as the partner can do here. And so they bring in things, but what they get out of it is for this company less than for this company. So here you see what they call a dissipation of the firm-specific advantage bundles to the alliance partner. So it's knowledge, for example, and this is knowledge about the routines, is knowledge, for example, about total quality control processes. Whereas here, it's more a patent or a standalone firm-specific advantage. A variation here, what could happen then as a result of it, when the two partners exit from the alliance, and you see that what happens is that they exit, they have achieved, for example, their learning goals, and what they can then develop is some knowledge, but what this partner can develop is much smaller than what this partner, for example, can develop. So you have, and they have grown the standalone firm-specific advantages together with this part, this triangle is bigger than what they have learned from it, and then they should stop, right? Because then they say, okay, it's asymmetric. We don't get a lot out of it. They increased both location-bound and non-location bound knowledge. So this has grown more than here. So then maybe it's a sign that the alliance, benefits of the alliance are asymmetrically distributed. Now, there are, of course, some other articles. So this is all based on a lot of literature by Hemel, Prahalad. There are some other interesting insights. And one is the article by Anderson and Jepp. And this is more pessimistic about the dark side of close relationships. Well, they say the best relationships on the surface, it seems as if this is a nice alliance, it lasts already very long, but in fact, there are a lot of problems of bounded rationality, remember? So bounded rationality, you cannot expect, you cannot predict everything, there is a lot of uncertainty. And in fact, we should go where the most interesting contribution of Anderson and Jepp is that they give an advice in terms of safeguards. 6 safeguards that you need to put in place to avoid this negative or dark side of alliances. The first one is, the first recommendation is to install a regular re-evaluation of the alliance relationship. And so to say, okay, to bring in new evaluators, for example, maybe external people from the board, external people from the board, people who are not in the departments which are involved in the alliance, but they are outsiders, but still insiders in the company, and to see, okay, what is now the balance? So evaluate. Second, of course, there should be a focus on profitability. So they say, yeah, well, you hear it in consulting or in the academic literature, we learned a lot, and and we sold together. We sold already the prototype, and the turnover is quite high, but no profitability yet. Third is always say, okay, if we didn't do this with an alliance, the idea of the best alternative. So a kind of backup. Also invest maybe in these alternatives, because it might be that after a while your alliance partner quits the alliance and you are very much dependent on that inflow of knowledge. So maybe you start already to develop things yourselves without the partner. Also develop resources that cannot be redeployed by the others, right? That's the idea outside the alliances with a loss of value. So that is swapping hostages, take the other into hostage, because if you're both of you dependent on everything which is only developed in the alliances, yeah, maybe, and that is the discussion also between HaHaHa and Danone, that they both develop their own brands and other things. Okay, it's a kind of normal reaction that they are not, if someone runs away with the knowledge, that you can still do something, right? That you are not completely out of ideas and losing crucial projects. Fifth is, of course, common goals that you also have in a joint venture situation, for example. It's important to set the goals. What will we learn? What will we develop together? In terms of the pharmaceutical developments, for example, when will we stop working together because it becomes too dangerous? That's also explicitly stated in the contract. And avoid kind of vicious cycles of suspicion. We think that they are developing something and we don't know it. That's, of course, to be avoided. So, in fact, we get into the discussion again of cultural distance, of course. Alliances, in many cases, strategic alliances are between partners that are far away. And in high distance countries is, of course, always more complicated. Although you can, you can Skype, you can Zoom, you can do everything, and you have seen the persons in real life, and you work with them already many times. But there are some time frames. Remember the long-term versus short-term orientation of Erin Meyer and Hofstede. Remember all these, the hierarchy, who is really responsible. So goals and time frames differ. There are cultural obstacles in learning. There are also, if it's higher distance, of course, because the people don't see each other and are not in touch with each other, there is more suspicion about, okay, they are stealing IDs from us. And there is also some problems with resource combination, and that you say, okay, they are using this for something else and we cannot trace it because we don't have regular factory visits, we don't have regular meetings on the spot, we cannot see it, we see people on screen, but we don't know what they are doing, etc., etc. So sometimes these people need to fly to the partner, and now it's of course more difficult. But there is this, so alliances, we see that alliances with closer, with partners which are closer in terms of geographical and cultural distance, they are in many cases more successful than with partners which are at a high distance. But that doesn't mean that there cannot be alliances with faraway partners that are very successful. So if you, for example, look at the Starbucks joint venture with Tata in India, very successful. There is some articles about the decline of what we call emerging economy joint ventures published by some Indian scholars. It's interesting because you see there were many of the joint ventures in the emerging economies and especially in India where the aim was actually market seeking. Right? So they teamed up with a partner in an alliance because they wanted, Starbucks wanted to have access to distribute coffee there, to distribute its product, but they could not do that on their own. And they did it in a joint venture with some of the Tata companies, because Tata, you know, this conglomerate, but they are also partly in food, and so with that division. In India, most of the joint ventures were in 5 sectors. They were in chemicals, in pharmaceuticals, in engineering, in IT, many alliances in IT, and also in consumer goods. And that is then more market seeking. The idea of these companies was actually to go to the Indian market, but they needed a partner. And instead of acquiring some companies or setting up things from scratch, they said, okay, we just do an alliance, a penetration option, because there was a liberalization of the market in India in 1991, and joint ventures are, in many cases, they are set up because it's the only way of having access in the market. The other things, full ownership was excluded because of regulation and regulatory limits. So 100% ownership was, for example, not possible. The idea is then that the local partner contributes, of course, and one of the FSAs, one of the firm-specific advantage that the local Indian partner has is access to government contracts, access to the distribution, access to, and that is, for Starbucks, it would have been very difficult to set it up on by themselves. So they really counted on the Tata company to give them links to the regulatory partners, and also to give them, allow to be perceived also as a more local company that is teaming up with a local company. So allowing national responsiveness, and that national responsiveness, remember we had before in the Stopford and Wells typology, where we said on the one hand, you have advantages of standardization and agglomeration if you just put your own products on the market. But maybe you need to adapt the coffee of Starbucks and the products and the pastries of Starbucks to the flavors which are interesting for the Indian market. And there you need to have a partner who can give you advice. And that partner was the joint venture partner. Now, the liberalization in India, if you look at joint ventures, growing business in the Kale and Anand article, and you saw that equity joint ventures were often preferred. So in 91, and they liberalized, and they set up, and then there were a lot of joint ventures set up in India. Why? And because they were, of course, formed, there is one negative reason. There is a difference between the entry mode you prefer and the entry mode you do. That is also an interesting analysis. Wholly owned subsidiaries were not possible. So that, of course, were even prohibited. And there were two categories of equity joint ventures, mostly between a market-seeking multinational such as Starbucks and the likes, and a local firm from emerging economies such as India. And in fact, there were 5 important changes which made that possible. It's a bit similar to Hungary in the 80s. Hungary was a country behind the Iron Curtain, so to speak, but joint ventures were already allowed in the 80s. There were many Austrian companies, many companies in the consumer goods sector that already had a joint venture in Hungary before the transition and before the 89 change, right? The transition to market economies. And in fact, the idea of the joint venture was that the multinational, of course, had a stronger multinational strategy setting gradually, and they increased also their equity stake. In the beginning, they had like 20% ownership in the equity ownership in these joint ventures, and they gradually, many of them, increased their ownership. They increased also control. They increased also board representation of people from India, for example, to have more access to the opinions of these people. And of course, they could, the multinational, the input of the multinational or the non-location bound firm-specific advantages, such as technology, management skills, also financial capital in the joint venture was put by this multinational. And then the local firm, they were very valuable in putting local firm-specific advantages, such as the market knowledge about India, the government ties, how to get contracts, distribution, which is very, very complicated if you're not from India, the brand names. Also, and there were local brand names, local Indian brand names that were put into the venture. And in many cases, they replaced the local CEO gradually by an expat, because these expats also wanted to learn about the local market. But in fact, it was very crucial that they had the local CEO first, because they had much more knowledge about the entry strategy and the marketing plan and everything in India. So there is, and this is an interesting database that they use, the incentive for alliances with gradually disappeared then, and except if there was still a strong complementarity, and in many cases they increased the ownership, and these companies became wholly owned subsidiaries. So what is interesting is that in this case of the Kale Anand article, we see that the foreign multinationals, they learned a lot about India by these alliances. And so by really learning a lot about the local markets, about the distribution, about how to cope with bureaucracy, or how to cope with difficult, so no transparency in how to convince Indian clients to buy their products. Now, why is it the case that these foreign multinationals learned a lot? In the authors, Kale and Anand, they motivate this by first a stronger intent to learn from the partner. So gradually they realized that they needed the local knowledge, that they were better learning also from prior experiences with the local partner. If they stayed on with the same local partner, they also learned gradually more and more. So that's the relationship between the two became more intense. They learned also the routines, how to do business in India. And they fostered interaction between the alliance personnel and the personnel of the multinational. So it is also important that between in the alliance, the people that are involved in the collaboration, that they talk to the managers and the personnel of the multinational itself, who are not involved in the alliance, but my argument there about the internal dissemination, diffusion of the knowledge which we get by working together with the foreign company. So these are stated, and these are found in this article, and there you have what you should do for the learning routines is that you should explicitly assign individuals to manage the learning function. And you say, okay, these are the people that evaluate whether we learned from our partners. Rotating managers, that's always a good idea, and employees between the multinational and the venture, because otherwise it stays within the venture or the alliance in general, alliance also non-contractual, and the joint venture also with equity infusion. Rotating these people, because otherwise, if the alliance stops, it's only limited to the people who were involved. And systematic interaction. So you see, these are tricks to use to really get the most out of it. If you think about, so the learning is not symmetric. Unfortunately, in many cases, we find that the multinational and the local partner, there is instability. A joint venture also, in many cases, it's kind of a real option. The real option, just in case that it becomes interesting, then we can decide to stop the joint venture, to increase the partnership, so to increase the ownership to 100%. And in many cases, and these are kind of transition corporate governance situations. Because in many cases of the Kale Anand article, the multinational won the learning race against the partner, and there was a growing incentive then if we put in more, if we get out of it, and we also want to get out of it more. So the joint venture became 100% subsidiary, right? A fully owned subsidiary. So here, again, my scheme, because you see that we believe in the dynamics of entry modes. So we see that many of our alliances, after a while, they become equity joint ventures, and after a while, the equity is increased because the partner who gets more out of it, it can be a large multinational. The large multinational says, okay, I want to benefit also from these location advantages in the host country. Now I have the marketing knowledge, I have the distribution, I have the government ties, I have the brand name, and I want to be able to fully exploit that. And again, a picture. So you see an alliance here in emerging economies, where you see that, in fact, this trapezoid, this is in the emerging economy. These are location-bound firm-specific advantages that they have now, and that they can, together, they can bundle something and they can exploit this through the alliance. Now they have access and they have benefit, that they benefit from the location advantages in the host country. Whereas here, this is a situation in the emerging economies where the partner is actually then a fully grown multinational itself. So you see the alliance, and you see the emerging economy multinational, and they have everything, right? They have the firm-specific advantages, they have the routines, and they both, and you see the arrow in both directions. That's an ideal situation. That's an ideal situation. You have the partner is a fully grown multinational as well. They are more equal partners, right? Compared to the previous slide, you see that they are not so equal. Whereas here, you see both of them share actually the same. And they have the same type of input, and the alliance here, this is the alliance within the dotted line, they are equal, they have become equal partners. So that is, of course, in the long run, what you would like to have. Here you have an alliance which is a bit asymmetric. So the color, so the light green color is what they learn from it. They absorb knowledge. We will talk about this later also. And the absorption of new knowledge from your partner is here. So the large multinational, they absorbed this, the light green. And in fact, the emerging firm is here learning more. It's learning this part and this part absorbed, and this is the darker one, is the absorption of existing knowledge, and then you have the extra effect. Both absorb new knowledge, but maybe it's not so symmetric here. So that is important. And not in all alliances everything is symmetric. In many cases it's asymmetric. It's like mergers and acquisitions, where we will also see that in fact 50-50 mostly that is not very realistic, that everyone and that they share the benefits equally. So to give you some examples of competitors which have formed alliances, for example, Apple and IBM. In the airline industry, there are many alliances in the airline industry, and this had also to do with the fact that regulation and that mergers and acquisitions were not possible. And if you think about it, and you have one important alliance is the Star Alliance, the Star Alliance between Lufthansa and United Airlines, other partners, or the SAS group from Scandinavia, Thai Airways. This is one alliance, also headquarters Frankfurt. Then you have, on the other hand, you have the SkyTeam with KLM and headquarters Amsterdam. So SkyTeam members, or again, you see KLM, you see Air France. They didn't merge, it's kind of alliance. They also work together with an American partner, because the others also, they have United Airlines, while KLM, they team up with Delta Airlines. They have also an Asian partner, Korean Air, and Alitalia. So that's a second alliance, which was formed in 2000, so which is already 20 years, an interesting alliance. And then you have, the One World Alliance with BA, headquarters London. So British Airlines, together with also an American partner, of course, American Airlines, Japan Airlines, Cathay Pacific, and some others. So you see that in the airline industry, they didn't merge because it was not allowed, but and then you have, and what you see then is if it's not allowed, they still want to have together some frequent flyer contracts, some hubs that they share. So there are, of course, motivations to do the alliance. Remember, we had 3 motivations, the R&D. We had to cut costs and to cut development time framework. So this is, of course, also something that they do. And they actually, what they are building up is what we call alliance-specific advantages. Alliance-specific advantages can be exploited now globally in terms of marketing expenses, joint development, but also campaigns that they do. And the new firm-specific advantages evolve in a kind of alliance-specific advantages. And the members can, if you are a client of one of the companies of the alliance, you have some reduction if you fly then on the partners' connections. And in fact, that works. Together, more international flights than any other airline. Now, this is an older advertisement for Jet Airways. There's also Etihad. They form an alliance. So if you think about it, there are important key principles for successful international partnerships and international alliances. Prevent that you have this dependency spiral in many cases, in outsourcing cases, that you say, okay, I really depend on the others developing now something and I don't get anything out of it. So that is, of course, not the purpose of an alliance. Limit also the diffusion of firm-specific advantages by making them mobile and by making sure that they are embedded in your company through internal transfers. We had 6 safeguards for examining whether your alliance is doing well and whether the agreement should be changed. What you should evaluate is not the length of the alliance or the pure existence of the alliance, but the learning effect. And that's the very important thing. It is that alliances are, per definition, they are short-term, but you must be able to evaluate them on what you as a partner learned from it. the impact, of course, on the quality of your relationship with your alliance partners. Now, there is an interesting application. And that is the application on Danone and Wahaha, which is already a long term. And in 2009, they split. You know that Danone has is an interesting company, of course. They have their first market is France and Spain, but then China and the US, they already engaged in a lot of activities in China, and they had this company Wahaha from Hangzhou, which had also interesting brands, and they wanted to enter the Chinese market through this alliance. And this is a case that is in chapter 12. So it's interesting to try to apply the framework that we studied now on the Wahaha joint venture. And you see that there was a lot of misunderstandings. So they wanted to share. It is a market-seeking alliance for sure, because China was an interesting market for BSN, which is the name of the company, of course, of Danone. And they wanted to expand, and they wanted to team up of course, but to avoid technology leakages and to learn a lot about the market in China, because for their dairy production, for their water production, for medical and nutrition, for baby nutrition, and for all these products, for all the divisions, China promised to be an interesting market. Now, what I want you to consider is what are the intentions. So read the case. It starts on page 373. Danone's affair, it is called in China because it was a long story about a non-perfect marriage whereby the two companies in the beginning, in fact, they give a lot of autonomy to the subsidiaries that they had there. And then they had joint venture partners and also non-joint venture partners. And so there was a difference in understanding about what these joint venture partners could do for Danone. A lot of suspicion from both sides. So look into how this relationship evolved during 11 years of alliance and cooperation between the two. How did the bargaining power change? Did the long-term cooperation between the two firms lead to more trust and less suspicion? So what are the problems of bounded reliability between the two firms? And is there kind of what we call a vicious cycle of suspicion once they don't start to not to trust each other anymore? In the beginning, there was a 41% of Danone owned 41% in a joint venture together with the group Peregrine and also Jinga, which is a company from Singapore. Then they tried to increase ownership, but Danone, they started also to invest in competitors of Wahaha. So there are errors made on both sides, right? They increased their ownership to 98% in the Wahaha group. But then, of course, so there is not a kind of view of the one was more credible than the other. Both of them really committed errors. And Danone also worked with competition. Wahaha, they also developed some brands that they took out of the venture. So there are a lot of realistic problems. The learning asymmetry is very well illustrated in this case. And the question is, has Danone been able to have access? Remember our two last slides about what is a successful alliance between this market-seeking, it was certainly a market-seeking company in this emerging economy. Did they have access then to location-bound firm-specific advantage? Did they learn about how to access distribution, how to, in China, how to develop brands in China? Should Danone have maybe rejected the joint venture entry mode in the first place? And because it's, of course, not complete control. So that is interesting. And then you can look into the web, because 2008, Danone sold its 51% stake in the Wahaha venture. And of course, we are already some years later, what happened? And that is something that you can, of course, look at as well. So this is actually the chapter on the alliances. Are there questions? So I want to remind you that you can send, some of you did already, you can send me an email concerning the personal development papers also. If you want to work on alliances, that's also something interesting because there is a lot of literature on entry modes, right? So far everyone sent me interesting, so applicable subjects. Make sure that it's also an empirical article, so and that you can talk about not only hypotheses, but also whether they are confirmed or not and why, because then you have a nice discussion with some other articles that I use in the course or that are in the literature list of your articles. So I want you to be able to be critical, right? Are there some questions?
Yes, I have one question. I would like to know if we are supposed to receive the feedback concerning the first version of the work that we sent.
Yeah, but so the first paper that you just had, the A4, so I agreed on all the projects, right?
Okay.
So yeah, so and that was the start. So that I made a list already. Also, there were a few people who added who are added to another group, but I have now a final list of the projects. No, you can for sure work on it, and then we do from the. So I give you then on the transition. So in the time between November 23rd. So you have there the presentations, but that will be online. In fact, that will be PowerPoints with comments. But I have now still on entry modes. Next week I will talk on M&As, and then I will talk on emerging markets, multinationals. And so you can ask me from now. You can show me temporary reports on your projects, of course.
So we are not going to receive a feedback of you, no?
Sure. So during the next weeks, you can always send me. So you mean on the first page, but the first page was just the project, right?
We were talking about MME, also entry mode in our report that we sent to you of 1 page, and we thought that you were going to send us a feedback.
Yeah, sure. No, that I will do. So the next weeks to come, and so you can also in so the weeks of the 23rd of November. So all the lectures then on the Mondays after that, I will make a list and I will so you can have a Skype with me, right? So 23rd. And then you're already in a more advanced stage, 30th of November and the 7th of December and the 14th of December. So we will then, you send me the temporary results, and then if you have questions, we talk about it with the group. I can do it in Zoom, Skype. I don't like Skype that much, so in Zoom is easier. And then we make a list each week of the groups that want to talk to me. And I do it every Monday morning. I can do it earlier if you like. So not from 10 to 12, but from 9 to 12, for example, so that we can give you constant feedback, right? But the projects are accepted. And so the company you work on and the geographies, maybe we also, because you want to compare some geographies, 3 geographies, then maybe you also would like to talk to me about that. Entry modes, indeed, now that you know already some of them. Okay. Yeah.
So there is no feedback during the report. Is after we have write our report that we are going to have a feedback.
No, you can send me the report, and so you can upload the report, and then we can discuss about it, right? So if there are some questions on the report and you say, I want to discuss on the entry mode, or I want to discuss on the geographical choice, right? Send me that, and then I schedule oral feedbacks every Monday morning.
Okay.
Okay? Yeah.
Okay.
Some other questions? So always send it to me, because Evelien van Poeken, she sometimes, I mean, she does it regularly, but always send it to me. You can send it to my ULB or to my KU Leuven address. But Evelien is an operations management professor, so she doesn't, I mean, it's not her specialization, and she's not responsible for the course. So I'm replacing her for IBS, right? Okay. So if you have I already responded to many emails, right? Yeah.
I have a question considering the group work.
Yeah.
What if the company already went to a country, for example, but didn't continue and they stopped? Is it, if you want to take that country, is it then entering the country, or is it investigating? Or an investigation?
Well, yeah. Well, it could be that they learned a lot from the failure in the past and they want to do it differently. That you can, for sure, you can do. And that's also entry. Well, but if you are just considering, yeah, so you say they are not there anymore, they don't even sell there anymore. Yeah, because as soon as you have some sales, you could say they are still there, right? So
no, I don't think so. It's for Decathlon, it's in the Scandinavian countries. They went to some Scandinavian countries, and if we go on the website now, the website is not even existing anymore.
No, yeah. So that's perfectly possible. There are many projects of companies that are, learned from their failures in the past. I give the example of Marks and Spencer in Belgium. So that's an interesting investigation that you do. So you must consider it as a consultancy project that you do for the board of directors, right? But it will be the other students who will read it, and I will read it. And then you need permission for capital expenditure, maybe, or you need permission to sell there to distributors, or all the entry modes that we have. And in fact, you need to make a point, right? You need to make an argument why you think, although they are not there, and they should, and they have been there in the past, or they have not been there in the past, you argue why they should go there with a certain entry mode, with certain costs and benefits, remember, the global market opportunity assessment. And so all the steps that I do every week with you, these are actually the questions of the project.
Okay, but is it, so they are entering again?
Yeah, they are entering.
It's not investigating. I don't know, it's because you put in the question, it's entering or investigation, and it was the question to know the other
well, it's an
investigation.
Yeah, it's an investigation about a possible entry. Maybe if you make your argument and your argument is not strong enough, then the board of your company will say, no, we will not do that. But you need to defend a project. Yeah? If you understand, you are a consultant and you say, okay, I see some opportunities to maybe sell there or maybe set up a joint venture, or right. And it's an investigation for an entry, if we can phrase it like that.
Okay, but if we want to choose another country to compare, because that's what we are supposed to do, should we choose then another country where they haven't been yet, or should we choose a country where they are already? That's to know what other countries we have to choose.
That's true. For prospection, it's better that you choose a country where they didn't commit already a lot, right? Because otherwise it's comparing apples with pears, that you say, or you could say, I take an existing market, which is very, very profitable, and I want to learn from that. That's also possible, but it's easier to do some prospection then. That you say, okay, I'm thinking about Scandinavia, but maybe another market, which is also new to us, we experience the same problems, right? So then it's really, you can call it's more investigating.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, because otherwise, it's of course biased. The result, if you say, okay, I'm already there and I have already a joint venture and I just want to increase equity, that's another completely other decision than I want to go to Scandinavia to sell there for the first time. And then you can say what are the advantages and the disadvantages of the one strategy vis-a-vis the others, but it's very difficult to compare, right? So then it's better to compare kind of a similar situation and then make an argument why it should be Scandinavia. And that will be because of the global market opportunity assessment, right? Or the partner that you find there that you cannot find in another place. Or you can say, I compare to another existing, very profitable market, and I learn from there and that market, and I think I will be as successful. And so you understand, you must have a reason why you take that market. You must have a reason why you think, okay, it's something comparable, and I have equal non-knowledge about these regions, or it's something, an error that I made in the past, and I learned so much about it that I retry to enter. That's also possible. You need to convince the shareholder, right? The board of directors that it's a good project. You cannot invest in everything simultaneously. There is one project that you would like to be approved in the board. Okay.
Excuse me, madam.
Sure.
Regarding that, should we choose one specific country or can we choose a region?
Yeah, well, the idea is to compare 3 countries. Then, if you do one country, you don't see anything if you don't work comparatively. And you say why.
Yeah, that I understand, but she just asked for Scandinavia, but can
then
we,
of course,
for example, just Norway, or is it better if we choose Scandinavia, for example?
Yeah, it's better if you choose a few countries and then you make a choice, but it could be that you want to set regional headquarters for the whole region, but then you say, okay, it's Denmark and Sweden and Norway added up, right? Yeah.
Because, for example, we are working on IKEA setting up shops in South America.
Yeah.
Should we choose a specific, should we compare 3 countries in South America?
I would do that. Yeah, I would do that. Because, it's enormous, it makes an enormous difference, right? And we have data, we have very good data on country level.
Okay, so is it better to choose countries in South America or 3 countries that are very different all around the world?
Yeah, well, yeah, you can do both, but if you take countries all around the world, then of course your cultural differences will be, it's also possible. So I'm not forcing you to say, okay, I need to compare countries that are completely different. Then of course there could be completely other cultural problems, completely other distance problems, completely other entry modes problems. If you do countries that are more similar, and that you have experience already in similar countries, remember my liability of foreigners, then it will be more difficult to say, okay, that country is much better, but it's also possible. And so you must also say maybe there are agglomeration effects. If I go to 3 countries which are very close to each other, maybe I enter one country with the purpose to open market. Is there a regional market there? Is there open borders or not? That makes a difference, right?
Yes. Okay.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, some other questions? So you can always ask by mail, of course. So then next week we are talking about mergers and acquisitions, and I want you to prepare something because I thought, so I will deal with a case, an interesting case of an Indian windmill company, so wind energy company, Suzlon, taking over the German Repower company, and we will ask some questions about it. For the chapter Sudarsanam on M&As, I will scan it in because I heard that at Solvay you don't have the book in the library. I have it. So I will scan it in and then put it on the Université Virtuelle. And then I have the article by Awate also. Yeah? So I wish you a nice week again, right? And we see each other next week talking about the next entry mode, which is mergers and acquisitions. And then I do the week afterwards, I specifically focus on merger and acquisitions by emerging economy companies, because there are a lot of things happening there. And there I have a longer case, which is the Tencent case, a Harvard Business School case that we will deal with. And I will put the questions also on UV. That will be the last theoretical lecture. And then we do the interchange. So while you are working on your projects, we have the contact hours then each Monday morning to tackle with the whole group. The idea is to come in a Zoom session and to discuss with the whole group. And you, of course, have distributed your tasks. Someone is maybe specializing in the entry mode. The other one is specializing in cultural distance. Another one is doing another topic. So, but I prefer that the whole group is present because you also learn from each other in discussing the projects. Right? Okay, so we see each other next week then. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.